Are miniatures in your board games really necessary? And contrary to the hoard of plastic you have on the table here, my answer is going to be a resounding no. It's 100% not necessary, not in the slightest. See, I recently got a bunch of miniatures from a few publishers, from Oathsworn. I have a few Oathsworn sample miniatures over here, including this little person with her unequipable weapons or whatnot that I'm not even going to try to slide in on the camera because that would not work. I have a bunch of Storm Thunder miniatures over here. These Storm Thunder prototypes, the most recent batch of miniatures, and they're pretty. They're very pretty. I mean, Storm Thunder is a game that I went all in on, and I don't know what the final copies are going to be like, but if they're anything like these prototypes, then I will have a lot of pretty miniatures. And then V Commandos. V Commandos, a game that I absolutely love, a game that I backed Assassin's Creed, specifically because I wanted to get, well, V Commandos, but with miniatures. They are suddenly putting out a new version of V Commandos with miniatures toppling over my hand, and suddenly this new V Commandos, it has miniatures. That game that relied on pure tokens to abstract the characters as you figured out the tactical stealthiness of, mastering the board and taking out the Nazis and doing whatever. Well, suddenly we have miniatures to go along with the game that 100% did not have miniatures before. And it made me want to do this video of, are miniatures necessary? I think specifically more so is going to be V Commandos, a game that did just fine without miniatures. Although just fine is going to be a relative statement when you compare it to, well, how well it actually did. It got rated well, people like it. But the critical mass adoption or whatnot, or how well it did compared to Assassin's Creed, although granted, Assassin's Creed with its IP is definitely not a fair comparison. But are miniatures necessary? They add to the cost of a game. They're increasing the barrier to entry. That's not a good thing, right? We just had Primal on Kickstarter. Primal, a game that had basically a $200 entry point price tag once you factor in shipping. That was just the barrier to entry. That was not the all-in. And even to get all the miniatures, everything else, you're talking about like $350, and you can spend up to like $450 if you wanted to get terrain and sleeves and everything else. That's an expensive experience. And it's a game that's an experience that's made more expensive by the miniatures. It's not the only cost, don't get me wrong, but it certainly is a cost. When you compare it to DEI or Awakened Realms, whenever Awakened Realms, the Great Wall had a miniatures, had a meeple only pledge. When you compare it to DEI, which also had a meeples only pledge. When you compare it to Nemesis Uprising, which had acrylic standees. When you compare the price points of games with miniatures versus games without miniatures, there is a clear cost differential at play. There's a clear barrier to entry to people experiencing the game, and you could easily argue that's hurting both the players who don't get their hands in it, as well as the publisher who can't get that mass adoption of their game. And yet we keep pumping out games with miniatures. Because despite that barrier to entry, the practical reality is that games with miniatures tend to do better on Kickstarter. In general in life too, but in Kickstarter more so. Kickstarter is all about that deluxeified experience. Kickstarter was about, bringing projects to life, but especially in the board game space, it has certainly migrated. It's not just about a singular, bring this project to life or whatnot. Rather, it's about how can we get the nicest, prettiest, most deluxeified thing that we can get our hands on. And most often, that will be miniatures. Even when they are completely unnecessary. They're always unnecessary, don't get me wrong, but there are ranges of just how unnecessary a miniature can be. V Commandos, when it survived purely on tokens, it's going to be a reminder that this was a game that did just fine with tokens, at least in terms of the reviews and ratings. If we compare it to Awakened Realms and ISS Vanguard and Aetherfields and the giant boxes full of expensive sun-dropped miniatures that are, they're pretty, don't get me wrong, they are very, very pretty, but they barely have any place in the game. I've gone through a whole bunch of Aetherfields. I have not completed it just yet, but Aetherfields is a game where the miniatures are basically glorified tokens, glorified placeholders that, while pretty, only share the board for a short time. And Storm Thunder is going to have that same problem. If you're backing Storm Thunder, late pledge is still open and whatnot, but if you're backing Storm Thunder, you'll see that you can spend easily up to $600, $700 on this game. And a big part of that's going to be the fact that just like in Aetherfields, you can buy miniatures for every single singular experience you will have, every single encounter you will have, no matter how infrequent that miniature appears. But if you want to rummage through your box and find that perfect miniature and put it on the board so you can be with that mini for the next, 10, 20, 30 minutes before putting it back in its box, possibly never to be seen again, you can do that, but it's certainly unnecessary. Now, when you have games like Zombicide Black Plague, then it's certainly going to have more of a presence on the board, more of a factor. When you're talking about those hordes of zombies, you're going to, if you played Black Plague, if you played any Zombicide, you could certainly abstract the experience down to, green cubes for the walkers, purple cubes for the runners, red cubes for the fatties, figure out whatever extra bonuses you're playing with, and just use colored cubes. But you could easily argue that that would start taking away from the experience. Now, meeples should be able to work. You can customize a few meeples, give them that experience. It's not a problem. Standees, absolutely. Miniatures are still going to be unnecessary. It's not a question at all. They vary in just how unnecessary they are, but whichever game you are or are not talking about, miniatures are not something that is required for the experience you are having. The problem is, neither is anything else. Neither is the art that goes on the box. Neither is the art that goes on the cards. Neither is the fact that there's a box at all. You could just give them brown, those brown Kickstarter stretch goal boxes. That could be your entire experience. Those cards that you paid thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to get glorified, beautiful art across every single card you have, it doesn't need to be there. Everything we have in games is really about giving you an experience, and it's a question of which things add to that experience at which price point and whether they're worth it or not. Of course, you can play the best game ever with no art or no art worth talking about. Terraforming Mars. Sorry. Or you could play a game with good art, and it will add to the experience. Now, the downside, and I think this is the problem people are concerned about, there's going to be multiple problems people are concerned about. The first is that miniatures, just like art, a pretty game, a game with miniatures, it can cover up a bad experience. That's certainly true. Storm Sunder has hundreds and hundreds of amazing miniatures, but I would not have backed it if it weren't for the fact that there were reviews put out by people who played and liked the game. That's going to hold true for Oathsworn as well for me. Oathsworn is a game that I did not back because of the miniatures, but once I found that it was a good game, the miniatures certainly gave me a reason to back it. This dragon from Black Plague, it's oh so pretty. This little thing from Black Rose Wars it's gorgeous. Now, I'm not getting it just for the miniature, but once I'm going to put this on my table, I wouldn't mind facing off against this thing. I don't even know what it is, but it looks like some sort of skeletal bone dragon, whatever it is. These cubes in Quad Heroes, these little tumbling cubes that walk around the board, they're fun. They're nice. They're going to have a new Kickstarter coming up soon, and I believe it's going to have pre-painted cubes, even further adding to the experience. And this is a new thing we're seeing, by the way. It's constantly upping the bar. We're now starting to see pre-painted miniatures more and more. We're seeing it. I've seen it in Commands, the animation collection. We had it in Freedom 5. The Quad Hero cubes. More and more pre-painted miniatures are becoming a thing that we're going to see. And again, it's going to add to the cost, but it also adds to the experience. Now, whether you value that experience, or more specifically, whether you value it at the price point it's at, is a different conversation. And it's certainly frustrating. There's no question that it's frustrating to want to play a game. Primal is incredible. It's a great game. I love playing Primal. Most people I know who have tried it have really enjoyed it and are saying it's a game to look out for. And yet it's a $200 price point, a $200 barrier to entry. That's not fun when you're on a budget. And you're sitting there looking at this game that didn't have to have miniatures. It didn't. Miniatures add to the experience, but it certainly didn't have to have it. You could have had literally a little arrow. You could have had an arrow for every single beast in the game. You could have had one single miniature. You could have just given this one miniature and proxy that in for every single creature in the experience, in the game. You're only fighting one monster at a time. You're never fighting two. Why do you need more than one miniature? And so that barrier to entry for something that doesn't necessarily adding to the experience is frustrating. It's not a question. But then again, the entire hobby is a luxury hobby. Monumental is the most overpriced deck builder I have ever played, but the miniatures in Monumental are pretty. They add to the experience. They add to the experience when it's on my table. Throwing down card after card in Dominion is one thing, and I love Dominion, but marching a horde of miniatures around the board and leveling up, there's no leveling up in Monumental, but doing other things in the game, it adds to the experience to have your towers on the board, to take your units and attack someone else. These things all add to the experience. Massive Darkness, which I love this little elephant character. I'm looking forward to the subsequent, Massive Darkness 2.0. I'm looking forward to that. And again, miniatures will add. They are not necessary. They aren't. And it is a barrier to entry, but you have to remember at the same time that Kickstarter, by its very nature, by what Kickstarter is and is trying to be, Kickstarter effectively needs to give people a reason to charge a lot of money. It's not a retail option. It's not a retail avenue of how to sell your games. And the upside of that is we get a lot of cool things. The downside of it is the price point is absolutely insane. Now keep in mind, you shouldn't back games that aren't going to be played, or at least more specifically, unless of course you want to. Because if you want to have the miniatures on your shelf or in their box on the shelf and never pull it off, that's by all means go for it. The problem with miniatures, they're shiny. It's like looking at video games nowadays, and video games and all their amazing graphics. When you dive into Steam and you see, wow, I want to play Mirror's Edge 2, I want to get the newest Call of Duty, and I want to get that game and this game, and they all look so pretty and they all look so fun to play. We live in an age where every single thing is at our fingertips, and that includes the interest and appeal of every single thing. What we don't know doesn't hurt us, but we know everything now. We know all about the games that are present. We know all about the Kickstarters that are available. If you subscribe to my channel, if you subscribe to any other Kickstarter channel that covers Kickstarters, you're going to be presented with a host of games that you want. All of them, or most of them, with completely unnecessary miniatures. Some of my favorite games are going to be guilty of this. Vindication, my top 10 games of all time, is a game that I don't feel the miniatures add to the experience, and it's a game that I would happily pay less money to have that game without miniatures. But for me personally, that's an exception. For me personally, I want miniatures in most of my other games. I value the experience. I value the time that I put into playing a game, and playing the same game without miniatures is just not quite as much fun. Stronghold. Stronghold is a 2-player asymmetric tower defense game that does the whole thing with cubes. It does. And it's a well-rated game. It's well-liked, but it doesn't have the critical appeal, the critical, adoption or whatnot of a Black Plague, of a Massive Darkness, of a Kingdom Death Monster, of any of these other games. When you take out the things that make a game pretty, you're also hurting the target audience. Because the initial premise here is that putting a barrier to entry hurts the publisher, and it hurts the people who don't get to experience that. And that is certainly going to be true. But taking out pretty things from games is also going to have the same effect. People will not get their hands on a game if it's not as pretty. We have a new standard. We used to live in the age of Days of Wonder being the gold standard of board games. Every other company put out games that looked like okay at best. And Days of Wonder every single year would put out hit after hit, all looking gorgeous, premium, deluxeified. Everyone wanted to get their hands on them. And many of them weren't even that great, by the way. They had a lot of hits. But they have a lot of solid games. One or two ones that really broke out, and it depends who you're classifying in terms of, mass market adoption, because they certainly knocked it out of the park there. But they were the gold standard of games that looked like a premium experience. And now they're just average, because the market has risen along with everything else. Now we have Elf Creek Games putting out games with coins that are going to cost you like $60 extra just to get your hands on a few extra coins. You could buy 2 board games for the price of the coins. But it depends what you value in life. If you value your time more than you value more games, then wouldn't you want to have the best possible experience? Wouldn't you want to deluxify that experience as much as possible? I remember when I first got into gaming, I avoided Eclipse, because Eclipse was a $70 game or $80 game at the time, and I thought I can get 10 games for that price. I bargain hunted left, right, and center. I didn't play the games that I bargain hunted. Having more games doesn't mean you're playing them. Having more games just means you have more games. So for myself, and speaking only for myself, I will always value the things that add to my experience. It doesn't matter that they're not necessary, and they certainly are not. But I want to have the most deluxeified experience possible. A game that is great, that could have had miniatures, but doesn't, is taken away from my own personal experience. A game that does have miniatures and isn't good is leaving my collection, because I'm not playing garbage games no matter how pretty the miniatures look. Ideally, I want the best of both worlds. I have Castles of Burgundy is an looking game. Terraforming Mars is okay at best. These are games that I love and will keep despite the flaws in them, despite the physical flaws, the way they look, the way they present, the deluxeified experiences. Because first and foremost, gameplay over everything. That is always going to be true. But you can still have good miniatures along with good gameplay. Some of my favorite games, Cthulhu Death May Die, Zombicide Black Plague. These are games in my top 10 games of all time. Blood Rage, my #1 game of all time. Blood Rage versus Innis is not a comparison when you're talking about which one has a better table presence. The art we could debate, certainly, because it's different styles. But one simply has better miniatures. One simply has better board presence. It's not really a conversation, although it's a matter of opinion, so everything's really a conversation. I value my gaming time. I value my experiences. Now I get rid of all those cheap games whenever I can, and instead I get the best possible games I possibly can, regardless of the price point. Because I want to play games, and I want to enjoy myself as much as possible while playing it. Now there is a flip side to this, and this is the part that does make me pause, which is going to be the barrier to entry in terms of getting things to the table. Because at the end of the day, like Terraforming Mars is a good example here, where I back the Terraforming Mars big box. And I'm hopeful that it will add to my experience. I'm hopeful that it will improve my Terraforming Mars gameplay. But it also well may be something that makes Terraforming Mars harder to get to the table, because now I have to take an extra box off the shelf, extra tiles to take out and set up, that could add to how hard it is to play. That's certainly a factor. The more miniatures you have, the more everything you have to manage is going to add to how hard it is to play. Kingdom Rush is a game that I've really been enjoying, but the box and the size of it is not super interesting. Not super easy to get to the table, which is why they're addressing in the new Kickstarter with an insert, a new game trays insert, to make it much easier to take everything out, because that is something you have to take into account. Quad Heroes for me has the exact same problem. A great game with a little bit harder to get to the table, although the miniatures really aren't the problem there, it's the general box. So accessibility is going to be a factor for me, and it's something I do weigh up, or take into account or whatnot. Storm Thunder is certainly going to have that. The idea of reaching into hundreds and hundreds of miniatures to find out the ones that are the correct fit, it's just, the harder it is to get to the table and the less likely I am to play it, the more likely I am to reconsider whether it belongs in my collection at all. But that said, if I do like a game, I want it to be pretty. I want to add to the experience. And it's not just going to be about the miniatures. It's going to be the miniatures, the art, the accessibility, the board game, the presentation. Absolutely everything factors into that experience. Gameplay above all. But presentation can augment that experience. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. And have a good one.